I'm Erin O'Byrne and welcome to Everything EFL podcast. I'm passionate about serving teachers and I offer training for schools and institutions whose language teachers need a little refresher, a change of mindset and some super practical ideas to put into their classrooms straight away. There is no one-size-fits-all lesson plan, but you've got a friend and support system in me. I can help reduce your overwhelm, give you some teacher inspiration, and improve your work-life balance. How? With some solid advice, takeaways you can try out immediately, and some much-needed teacher love, because your well-being is important too. Are you ready to make small changes one step at a time and remember how amazing you are? Let's go! Hello, you gorgeous teacher. If you're one of my lovely regular listeners, welcome back. If you're brand new to Everything EFL podcast, you are most welcome and I hope you stick around. I hope everyone's feeling good. I'm going to go back to 2 episodes a month now that the launch of my Heart and Craft course is over. And also a little bit of news. I'm going to take a break in the summer for the first time ever in the 6 years this podcast has been running. I'm tired. I don't have the energy to produce podcasts every 2 weeks over the summer. Do forgive me. But listen, on my social media, there'll be suggestions for episodes to listen to on Thursdays, Throwback Thursdays, or just flick through the back catalogue. Choose an episode yourself. There's plenty there. Even if you listen to one, I suggest you listen again. You know, it's amazing what we forget. I don't know about you, but my head is so full, I've got the memory span of a goldfish. Also, before we start, I just want to ask you guys, if you could just imagine teaching in a hot room with no air conditioning, no whiteboard, no markers, no notebooks for your students, no pens, no tech, no cards, no flashcards, no scissors, no laptop, no printer, no access to the internet. And I want you to think about how that might feel. Now, I want you to think about that situation in a refugee camp in Kenya. And I want you to think about the 5 English teachers who were refugees themselves, who were doing their absolute best to teach the women of the camp English. I'm helping these teachers in Kenya in this refugee camp. It's called Kakuma. And I'm helping to raise money to provide basic supplies for them. And I'm just asking you to consider donating €5 to my GoFundMe. The details are in the show notes. I know you guys are an empathetic bunch. And I also know times are tough. So I'd be grateful for anything you could spare, no matter how small. Because even a few euros is enough to buy a couple of packs of biros. And that can make all the difference in a classroom. Okay, on with the show. Phrasal verbs. Everyone hates them. I haven't met a student who even remotely likes them. Today, we're going to do a brief overview of what phrasal verbs are and my thoughts on them, possibly some food for thought on how you might approach them in the future. One of the first questions that comes up is, are they grammar or are they vocabulary? Well, I think they're vocabulary in that they have a specific meaning. So, I think primarily we should treat them as such. I think the grammar part comes with the position of the pronoun, if there is one, and whether they are separable or non-separable. But let's just backtrack and do a little phrasal verb 101 for the less experienced teachers out there. We all know that phrasal verbs are verb plus preposition, and the preposition changes the meaning of the verb. Now, you often hear in definitions verb plus particle. Now, let's just clear that up, because of all my years of teaching, I've never really looked into what a particle actually is, and I don't think it really helps you or your students. But if you really want to know, according to the British Council, a particle is a word that has a grammatical function but does not fit into parts of speech, as in, to, like to fly. Right? To is an example of a particle, although it can also act as a preposition, as in I'm going to Spain, or, maybe look up to someone, phrasal verb. Cambridge Dictionary says a particle is a word, it's normally an adverb added to a verb to form a phrasal verb. And the example is he looked up. And yeah, I suppose you could say up is an adverb here because it's describing how he looked, the direction in which he looked. But anyway, this is just details, guys. I just usually say verb plus preposition for my students. I don't think they need to know anything else. And you're just going to confuse them if you use the word particle. So let's just stick to verb preposition for your sanity and for your students. But we can divide phrasal verbs into 4 main categories or types. The ones without an object, like take off, the plane takes off, or speak up. The ones with an object but are separable, like take your clothes off. Little digression here, guys. I'm not 100% sure, but I think with some of these really super common phrasal verbs like take off, turn on, I don't think it really matters where the object goes, but let me know your thoughts on that. Anyhow, you can also get phrasal verbs with an object but never separate, meaning that the object of the phrase must come after the whole phrasal verb. So, for example, go without, like go without food or water. Phrasal verbs with two prepositions are always, or pretty much always, non-separable. So, for example, come up with an idea or solution. And this is tough for students knowing where the object goes. And I think one nice little thing to remind your students is that roughly 60 to 70% of phrasal verbs are non-separable, where only 30 to 40% are separable. So, that might help, if they're not sure, just tell them to go for the non-separable version. Ones with two prepositions are pretty much always non-separable. And the ones without an object, well, they're non-separable, obviously. So going for non-separable, if you're not sure, is always the better idea, I think. But I think a good idea might be to use chunks. Now, usually I'm not that keen on gap fills, okay? But grammar exercises can be so much more than that. And you can do something in the form of like a mini dialogue. And I've seen this in, I think it was English file, maybe elementary before. But so I'm kind of stealing the idea from there. There's like a line of dialogue. And then an answer is a small phrasal verb chunk with a pronoun. So something like, this bottle is broken, or I broke this bottle. And then the matching response could be throw it out then. Okay, so you'll throw it out. And then, using those phrasal verbs in the form of a chunk with a pronoun, I think is super useful because they're nice and easy to digest, fairly easy to process. And then, you could use those in lots of different situations. And I think this kind of exercise would be very easy to generate using ChatGPT, or even if you create it yourself, it probably only take you a few minutes, and it will be a great resource to use again in the future. And of course, my advice would always be to use examples that students can relate to. Go without. I think going without your phone would be a great one for students of all ages these days. So what else do we need to know? Well, like I said, there are 4 kind of types, but there are also 2 distinct types. And this is where it gets interesting for me. Literal and idiomatic. Now, the basic phrasal verbs that lower levels usually use, they're the ones kind of learnt first. And they're the ones usually with the more literal meaning. So things like stand up, sit down, put on, take off. They're usually okay. They can kind of translate them and get the meaning. It's the idiomatic ones that cause the problems because students can't translate them, and they just have to understand that this means this. So if you think about, I'm looking forward to something, they have to learn that it means to be happy and excited about something in the future. But let's take something a little bit more complex, like drift apart. This has come up before in, I think, B2 class. So what I do is I usually begin with a physical kind of explanation of the verb itself without the preposition. So the more specific and uncommon the verb, the easier it usually is to do this, okay? But allow me to explain. So drift apart. I would start with maybe drawing a little picture on the board of the sea and maybe like a ball or a person just, in the water. And we kind of explain what drifting is and ask, clarify that by asking, is this going in a specific direction? Is it traveling with any purpose? Can it help the direction it's going? So that's kind of the concept of drift, right? So they get the concept of drifting. And then I would ask them if they've ever had a friend who they were good friends with, but now they're not. And invariably, people say yes. And then we can talk about the reasons. Was it because you had an argument, or was it because you just stopped contacting each other gradually? No specific reason. You just, changed. You met other people. You went to different universities. You got a new job and new friends. And if any of those sort of are, I get that, or that was me, then you can use the board to sort of draw a picture of 2 people drifting apart. And again, sort of reinforce that concept of apart is, in opposite directions. And then the idea of it's no sort of specific direction or intention, it just happens. So the next time you do some phrasal verbs, have a look and ask yourself, are they idiomatic? And I challenge you, take some time to look at the physical meaning of the verb first and see if that explanation helps you to guide your students to understand the idiomatic meaning. And it might help, and I often find that students are super interested in that kind of thing. And as you know, I'm always a fan of letting your students in on how things work, and something like this is just a little insight. And like I said, they generally get quite engaged. So look at your lesson plan. If there's a phrasal verb in there and it's idiomatic, think about how you're going to explain it. And with any other phrasal verbs coming up, think about how you might write a mini dialogue on the board with the object, like throw it out. Because I think also when we record phrasal verbs, we often sort of record their collocations. But a mini dialogue is a great way of students recording it, especially with that pronoun in there. And I think my biggest piece of advice is if you see something in your course book and you come across like a worksheet that's a list of 10 phrasal verbs with put or 10 phrasal verbs with off, skip it. Do not use it. No one ever learned anything from a list. It's meaningless, okay? Phrasal verbs should be learnt in context. And then you help students understand the meaning within the context. I mean, if you think of the amount of phrasal verbs that like take off, right? You could have the plane takes off. You could have a career taking off. You could have take off your shoes. One phrasal verb can have several different meanings. And this is why context is absolutely essential. And if students are recording notes, the dialogue thing is good, but a few collocations are always good as well. And they can record them in a spiral diagram, in a bullet pointed list, just whatever appeals to them visually, but I would say no more than 4 or 5, and make those collocations ones that students will relate to. You don't have to put, every collocation down. Choose carefully. You know your students best. Which ones do they need right here, right now? And anytime you're doing a text or you're looking at a transcript after a listening, get students to highlight the phrasal verbs. First of all, it's fun to see if they can actually identify them because, they don't always. And then you can ask them, does it have an object? Okay. Is it stated? Like, is it a noun or is it just like a pronoun? Okay, it. Brilliant. Let's do a little referencing exercise. What is the pronoun it referring to here in the transcript or the text? That's always super useful. You can never do enough of that. So that's noticing, which I talk about quite a lot. Episode 103 has a lot more information about that if you want to go back and listen to it. I think it's one of my most useful episodes and it does have the potential to really transform your teaching. You're welcome. So final tip, just make sure you're not overloading your students. Again, no lists, guys, okay? Give them examples that they'll actually need and they can relate to, and give them plenty of opportunity to review those phrasal verbs you give them at later dates. So I'm going to leave it there, guys. We can talk about, the perils and fundamentals of phrasal verbs for ages, but I know you don't have time for that, and I certainly don't. I need to take my dog for a walk because you know what? We need to do these things as well as work hard. We need to take those breaks and look after ourselves. Please join my Breathe Easy teacher newsletter community for updates about the Kakuma refugee camp, some teaching tips, some teacher love, and also discounts on future services and offers. And I've got a little idea brewing in my brain about another course, possibly more grammar-based. Let me know how you feel about that. I might ask you some questions on my social media and newsletters about that just to see what you really need. And if you want to pay it forward, please recommend this podcast to your colleagues. Share any of my stories or social media posts to the world out there. And of course, you can always give me a good review or a 5 stars on Spotify or iTunes. This really helps push me up the ratings and gets me noticed, as it's a very saturated world out there and I want to stand out. But I do need your help a little bit to spread that word. And of course, share the love. Bye.